There is a physiological response that happens to you in a specific and narrow category of situation, and it is, as far as researchers have been able to determine, found in no other species on the planet. You say something clumsy in front of people whose opinion matters to you. Someone points out a mistake you made in public. You are given a compliment that draws unwanted attention to yourself in front of a group. And within a second or two, without any conscious decision on your part, without any ability to stop it or suppress it once it begins, the blood vessels in your face and neck dilate, producing a visible reddening that broadcasts, to everyone watching, exactly the internal state you would frequently most prefer to conceal. This is blushing, and Charles Darwin, writing in 1872 in his book The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, called it the most peculiar and the most human of all expressions. Darwin's observation has held up remarkably well across a century and a half of subsequent research. Blushing appears to be genuinely unique to human beings, and understanding why turns out to reveal something unexpectedly important about the specific evolutionary problem that human social life created, and that blushing may have evolved specifically to solve. Let's begin with the physiological mechanism itself, because understanding exactly what is happening in the body helps clarify why this response is so theoretically puzzling from an evolutionary perspective. The physiologist Peter Drummond at Murdoch University, whose research has done more than perhaps any other single scientist's to characterize the precise physiological mechanics of blushing, has documented that the reddening associated with blushing results from the dilation of blood vessels, specifically in the face, ears, neck, and upper chest, a pattern of vasodilation that is regionally distinct from the vasodilation associated with physical exertion or ordinary thermal regulation. Drummond's research found that this facial-specific vasodilation is mediated by the sympathetic nervous system through a specific pathway involving beta-adrenergic receptors in the blood vessels of the face, a mechanism that appears to be somewhat separate from the general sympathetic arousal response that characterizes other emotional states, such as fear. This physiological specificity is itself theoretically significant, because it suggests that blushing is not simply an incidental byproduct of general emotional arousal, a kind of overflow effect from the broader physiological response to embarrassment, but appears to involve a specific and dedicated physiological pathway that evolved, or was at minimum specifically maintained and elaborated, to produce this particular and highly visible effect on the face specifically, rather than being distributed more generally across the body's vasculature the way ordinary emotional arousal typically is. This physiological specificity connects to what has become the central theoretical puzzle in blushing research. Why would evolution produce and maintain a physiological mechanism whose primary and most reliable effect is to involuntarily broadcast a person's internal emotional state, specifically their embarrassment or shame, to everyone around them, at precisely the moment when that person would typically most prefer to conceal that internal state? In nearly every other domain of emotional expression, human beings retain at least some capacity for voluntary control or suppression. Blushing is one of the very few emotional expressions that resist this kind of voluntary control almost entirely, a feature that led Darwin himself to describe it as involuntary in a way that most other expressions are not. The psychologist Ray Crozier at the University of East Anglia, whose extensive research on the psychology of blushing has become foundational to the modern scientific study of the phenomenon, has proposed what has become one of the most influential theoretical accounts of blushing's evolutionary function, arguing that blushing serves specifically as an appeasement signal, a reliable and involuntary indicator of social awareness and submission that functions to reduce the likelihood of social punishment or exclusion following a social transgression, by demonstrating to observers that the blushing individual recognizes their transgression, feels genuine distress about it, and remains committed to the social norms and relationships that the transgression has threatened. Crozier's account draws on a broader evolutionary framework in behavioral biology concerning what researchers call honest signaling, the proposal that because blushing cannot be consciously controlled or faked, it functions as a specifically credible and difficult to counterfeit signal of genuine social distress, in a manner directly analogous to the costly and difficult to fake signals of remorse and trustworthiness that we examined in earlier videos in this series on confession and fairness psychology. A person who blushes following a social transgression is providing observers with reliable evidence that they possess genuine social awareness and genuine investment in the social relationships and norms they have violated. Evidence that a merely verbal apology, which can in principle be produced strategically and insincerely, cannot provide with the same degree of credibility. This theoretical account has been tested experimentally by the psychologist Corine Dijk at the University of Amsterdam, whose research has documented that individuals who are shown to be blushing following an embarrassing social transgression are subsequently rated by observers as more trustworthy, more likable, and less blameworthy for the transgression itself, compared to individuals who commit an identical transgression without any visible blushing response. Dijk's research found this effect held even when observers were explicitly told that the transgression itself was serious, suggesting that the presence of a visible blush measurably softens social judgment independent of the objective severity of the underlying transgression, providing direct experimental support for the appeasement signaling account of why blushing might have evolved despite its apparently self-exposing character. Dijk's research has also documented a specific and theoretically important asymmetry. While blushing reliably improves social evaluation following a minor social transgression, such as a clumsy mistake, this beneficial effect diminishes and can even reverse for more serious transgressions, particularly moral transgressions involving genuine harm to others, where a visible blush response was not found to meaningfully improve and in some experimental conditions actually worsened. Subsequent social judgment. This finding suggests that blushing's appeasement function operates specifically within a bounded range of social transgressions, those involving competence failures, minor social awkwardness, or unwanted attention, rather than functioning as a general-purpose signal capable of mitigating judgment for any category of wrongdoing regardless of severity. The developmental question of when the capacity for blushing first emerges has been examined by the developmental psychologist Michael Lewis at Rutgers University, whose extensive research on the development of self-conscious emotions, the category of emotions including embarrassment, shame, guilt, and pride, that require a sophisticated capacity for self-awareness and self-evaluation relative to social standards, has documented that blushing does not appear in clearly recognizable form until approximately 15 to 18 months of age, coinciding closely with the developmental emergence of what researchers call mirror self-recognition, the capacity to recognize one's own reflection as representing oneself specifically, rather than another individual. Lewis's research proposes that this developmental timing is not coincidental, but reflects a genuine underlying cognitive dependency. Blushing requires the same fundamental cognitive achievement that mirror self-recognition requires, a sophisticated representation of oneself as an object of potential evaluation by others, sometimes called objective self-awareness. Before a child develops this capacity, embarrassing situations may produce simple distress, but do not produce blushing specifically, because blushing appears to require the specific cognitive machinery necessary to represent oneself as being observed and evaluated by others, exactly the kind of sophisticated self-referential social cognition that the broader theoretical account of blushing as a social signal would predict as a necessary developmental prerequisite. The evolutionary anthropologist Robert Trivers, whose broader research on the evolution of self-deception and social signaling has been influential across multiple domains of evolutionary psychology, has proposed a complementary account connecting blushing to the broader evolutionary logic of what he calls the deception-detection arms race. The proposal that as human social cognition evolved increasingly sophisticated capacities for detecting deception and insincerity in others, a corresponding evolutionary pressure favored the development of physiological signals that could not be consciously controlled or faked, precisely because such signals retain their value as reliable indicators of genuine internal state, specifically because they resisted the kind of strategic manipulation that more easily controlled expressions, including verbal statements and even voluntary facial expressions, remain vulnerable to. On Trivers's account, the specific involuntary and difficult-to-suppress character of blushing, rather than being an evolutionary design flaw or unfortunate side effect, is precisely the feature that gives blushing its functional value as a social signal. A blush that could be voluntarily produced or suppressed at will would lose the specific evidentiary value that makes it useful in the first place, because observers could no longer trust that a blush, or the absence of one, reliably indicated genuine internal emotional state rather than strategic self-presentation. The psychologist Mark Leary, whose research on the belongingness hypothesis we examined in an earlier video in this series, has extended his broader theoretical framework on social self-esteem and social monitoring to propose that blushing connects directly to what he calls the sociometer function of self-conscious emotions more broadly, The proposal that emotions like embarrassment and shame, and their physiological expression through blushing, function as an internal monitoring system specifically calibrated to track a person's current standing within valued social relationships and groups, activating specifically when that standing has been placed at risk by some social transgression or unwanted exposure, and motivating the kind of remedial social behavior, apology, appeasement, withdrawal of unwanted attention that would be expected to restore the threatened social standing. This sociometer account connects blushing directly to the broader belonging psychology examined in earlier videos in this series. If human survival throughout evolutionary history depended critically on maintaining secure standing within a social group, then a reliable, difficult to fake, an involuntary signal specifically calibrated to detect and communicate threats to that standing and to motivate the remedial behavior needed to restore it would represent exactly the kind of psychological and physiological adaptation that the broader evolutionary pressures documented throughout this series would predict. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention because it addresses an important cross-cultural question with significant implications for the evolutionary account. Whether blushing and its social meaning are universal across human cultures, or whether they vary substantially, depending on specific cultural norms around emotional display and self-presentation. The cross-cultural psychologist David Matsumoto at San Francisco State University has conducted extensive research documenting that while the basic physiological mechanism of blushing appears to be a human universal, present across every culture in which it has been systematically studied, the specific social interpretation and behavioral consequences of a visible blush show meaningful cross-cultural variation, connected to broader and independently documented cultural differences in what Matsumoto and other cross-cultural researchers call display rules, the culturally specific norms governing which emotional expressions are considered appropriate to show openly in which social contexts. Matsumoto's research found that in cultures with stronger norms around emotional restraint and the maintenance of public composure, a visible blush, while still interpreted as evidence of genuine embarrassment, is more likely to itself become an additional source of social discomfort for the blushing individual, compared to cultures with more permissive norms around open emotional display, where the appeasement signaling benefits that Dijk's research documented appear to operate more straightforwardly and with fewer complicating social costs. This cross-cultural variation is theoretically important because it demonstrates that while the underlying physiological capacity for blushing appears to be a genuine human universal with a plausible shared evolutionary origin, the specific social consequences of that physiological response, and therefore the net balance of costs and benefits that the blushing response produces for a given individual in a given cultural context, are substantially shaped by the broader cultural framework of display rules within which the physiological response occurs, a pattern consistent with the broader finding, well documented across the study of human emotion generally, that basic physiological and expressive mechanisms tend to be evolutionarily conserved and cross-culturally universal, even as their specific social meaning and behavioral consequences are substantially shaped by cultural context. The psychologist Peter de Jong at the University of Amsterdam has extended this research into the clinical domain, documenting that a specific subset of individuals experience blushing not as an occasional and mildly uncomfortable response to genuine social transgression, but as a chronic and severely distressing condition, sometimes called erythrophobia or fear of blushing, in which the anticipation of blushing itself becomes a source of significant social anxiety, in some cases severe enough to produce substantial avoidance of ordinary social situations. De Jong's research has found that this clinical condition often involves a specific self-reinforcing cycle, in which anxiety about the possibility of blushing itself triggers the sympathetic nervous system activation that produces blushing, creating a self-fulfilling pattern in which the fear of the response and the response itself become mutually reinforcing, a finding with significant clinical implications for the treatment of social anxiety disorders more broadly, and one that illustrates how a physiological mechanism that evolved to serve a beneficial social signaling function can, in a specific subset of individuals, become dysregulated in a manner that transforms it from an adaptive social tool into a source of significant psychological distress. The comparative question of whether any other species shows even a rudimentary precursor to human blushing has been examined by researchers studying primate behavior specifically, given that primates are the closest living relatives among whom such a precursor might most plausibly be expected to appear. The primatologist Signe Preuschoft, whose research on the facial expressions and social signaling behavior of macaques has been influential in comparative studies of primate communication, has documented that several non-human primate species display a so-called silent bared teeth display, a facial expression involving exposed teeth without vocalization that functions as a submission and appeasement signal in social contexts, involving status conflict or transgression of group norms. A functional parallel to human blushing in the sense that both signals communicate submission and reduce the likelihood of continued social punishment. However, Preuschoft's research and subsequent comparative work have been careful to note that this primate display, unlike human blushing, remains under at least partial voluntary control and does not involve the specific involuntary vasodilation mechanism that characterizes the human blush, meaning that while the social function may be broadly analogous, the underlying physiological mechanism, and specifically the involuntary and difficult-to-fake character that Trivers' honest signaling account identifies as central to blushing's functional value, does not appear to be shared. This comparative gap reinforces the broader theoretical picture that has emerged from this body of research, the specific evolutionary solution that blushing represents. An involuntary, physiologically costly, and therefore maximally credible signal of genuine social awareness, appears to be a solution that only the human lineage, with its unusually intense and unusually consequential reliance on maintaining trust and standing within cooperative social groups extending well beyond immediate kin, ultimately evolved. What emerges from this substantial body of research is a picture of blushing not as an embarrassing physiological malfunction, an involuntary betrayal of a person's attempt to maintain composure, but as a sophisticated and specifically evolved social signal, one whose very involuntariness is the source of its functional value, providing observers with a credible and difficult-to-fake indicator of genuine social awareness and continued investment in shared social norms and relationships, precisely at the moments when that credible signal is most socially valuable. The heat rising in your face after a clumsy mistake in front of people who matter to you is not your body failing to maintain the composure you are trying to project. It is your body doing exactly what an evolutionarily ancient signaling system, unique among all the species that have ever lived on this planet, was built to do: broadcasting, in a form too involuntary and too physiologically costly to fake, the specific and valuable social information that you notice, that you care, and that whatever social bond your transgression has threatened is one you remain genuinely invested in repairing. No other animal has ever needed a signal quite like this one, which may be the clearest evidence available that no other animal has ever needed quite as badly as you do to be trusted by the group it lives among. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.